The entire mansion heard the screams, but no one dared to intervene. Through tears and pain, she revealed something that brought him to his knees. The test he had planned became his greatest downfall, and the woman he humiliated would become his redemption. Chapter 1. New York City has always been a city of contrasts. On one side, the gleaming skyscrapers that touched the grey sky. On the other, the bustling streets where millions of lives intersected without ever truly touching. In the heart of the Upper East Side, one of the most exclusive areas of the metropolis, stood an imposing mansion that seemed to defy time. High walls, hand-forged iron gates, impeccable gardens that required an entire team to maintain their artificial beauty. This was the home of Edward Travers, a man whose story was intertwined with the very history of American corporate success. Edward wasn't born rich. This was a piece of information he made a point of repeating in interviews, at charity dinners, on any occasion his journey was mentioned. He came from rural Georgia, from a simple family that grew tobacco on someone else's land. But since childhood, Edward had something different in his eyes, a determination that bordered on obsession, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied with bread. At 15, he left the farm where he was born, with just a cardboard suitcase and the promise that one day he would return wealthy. And he did. Not to stay, but to buy the entire farm and all the neighboring lands. In the decades that followed, Edward built an empire. He started by selling automotive parts door to door. Then he opened a small workshop. In 10 years, he had a chain of auto parts stores. In 20, he owned one of the largest distributors in the country. By the age of 50, his name was among the 100 richest men in America, but the money hadn't made him lighter. On the contrary, with every million accumulated, Edward seemed to carry a heavier weight on his shoulders. His gestures were calculated, his words measured, his gaze always vigilant. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was at a charity event, almost 30 years ago, that Edward met Helen. She was 23, had just graduated with a degree in education, and was there only because the principal of the school where she worked had insisted. Helen didn't belong to that world of long gowns, expensive jewelry, and empty conversations about international travel. She was the daughter of a retired teacher and a seamstress. She had grown up in a modest apartment in Queens where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sound of buses passing on the avenue. She had simple dreams: to teach children, have a family, build a life with purpose. When Edward saw her for the first time, something in him stirred. Helen was standing near the window, observing the city below, oblivious to the buzz around her. She wore a discreet navy blue dress that was certainly not designer. Her brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, without the exaggerated styling of the other women present. But what captured Edward was not her appearance. It was the serenity she emanated, a peace he had never felt. Edward was not a man to beat around the bush. He approached and introduced himself. Helen recognized him, of course. It was impossible not to know Edward Travers, but she showed no awe. She didn't ask about his business, didn't try to impress him. They talked about simple things, about the city, about her work with the children, about the music playing in the background. And for the first time in many years, Edward felt something he had forgotten how to name: genuine interest in another person. The courtship was fast and intense. Edward wooed her with the same determination. He had used to build his empire: flowers every day, dinners at the best restaurants, weekend trips. Helen resisted at first, not out of pride but out of fear that this world wasn't for her, that she wouldn't be able to maintain her essence amidst so much luxury. But Edward was persuasive. He swore he loved her exactly as she was. He promised he would never try to change her. And Helen, perhaps out of naivety, perhaps out of love, believed him. They married in a discreet ceremony, against the wishes of Edward's advisors who thought he should marry someone from his social circle. But at that moment, Edward didn't care about others' opinions. He wanted Helen by his side, and so he had her. In the first years of their marriage, they were happy. Helen brought light to that cold mansion. She filled the empty rooms with laughter, with music, with life. She convinced Edward to spend more time at home, to slow down a bit. For a brief period, he managed. He had lunch with her, they walked in the garden at dusk, they traveled together on vacations. But old habits are like deep roots. Little by little, Edward buried himself in work again. Meetings stretched into the night. Weekends were taken over by business commitments. Helen tried to understand. After all, it was that dedication that had made Edward who he was. But understanding has its limits. And when loneliness becomes routine, even the strongest love begins to crack. Helen kept herself busy as best she could. She continued to work, even without needing the money. She kept in touch with her childhood friends, with her family. She created social projects, helped underprivileged communities, filled her days with purpose. But the nights were long, very long, and when Edward arrived, there were no more conversations. Just a mechanical kiss on the forehead, a silent dinner, and the sound of his footsteps going up to his office. It was like this for years, a polite but distant coexistence. Edward believed that being physically present was enough, that paying the bills, maintaining their standard of living, was a demonstration of love. Helen, for her part, learned not to expect more. She stopped suggesting outings, planning surprises, trying to salvage what they once had, not out of resignation but out of weariness, the kind of weariness that sleep cannot cure. The mansion, which had once been too large for two, now seemed like a labyrinth of empty corridors and unused rooms. Helen walked through it like an elegant ghost, always impeccable, always serene, but profoundly invisible. The staff adored her. Unlike Edward, who was respected for the fear he inspired, Helen was loved for the kindness with which she treated everyone. She always remembered birthdays, asked about their families, helped when someone was in need. She was human in a place where humanity seemed to have been left outside the gates. Among the household staff there was Matthew. He was 32, responsible for maintaining the gardens, and also handled small repairs on the property. Matthew was a simple man of few words, who had come from Mississippi in search of better opportunities. He worked hard, sent money to his mother every month, and lived in a small room at the back of the property. He had no great ambitions. He just wanted a decent life. Helen was always kind to Matthew. When it rained and he was working in the garden, she would have the cook prepare a hot coffee. When he injured his hand fixing a gate, it was Helen who insisted he go to the doctor, and even paid for the consultation out of her own pocket. They were small gestures, but they meant everything to someone like Matthew, who had never been treated with such consideration. Over time, they developed a discreet friendship, not in the sense of secret meetings or intimate conversations. Nothing like that. But there was a mutual respect, a silent complicity between two people who, despite coming from different worlds, shared the feeling of not quite belonging in that place. Matthew saw in Helen a different kind of employer, a good woman, in a universe of coldness. Helen saw in Matthew someone who still maintained simplicity and gratitude, values she feared she had lost over the years. Edward never paid attention to Matthew. To him, the staff were part of the house's structure, like the furniture or the works of art. Necessary but not worthy of attention. Until one day, during a business dinner at the mansion, one of the guests made a casual comment, a comment that would plant the seed of destruction. It was Richard Miles, a real estate entrepreneur with whom Edward had partnered for years. A middle-aged man. He had known Edward since the days when he was still building his empire. Richard had the inconvenient habit of making jokes at inappropriate times. That night, after a few glasses of whiskey, while the men were talking in the living room and Helen was in the kitchen supervising dessert, Richard let out a loud laugh. "You're a lucky man, Edward," he said, his voice slightly slurred by the alcohol. "You have it all. Money, power, and a beautiful wife who is also kind to everyone. Even the gardener, eh?" He paused deliberately as if waiting for a reaction. "I came by the other day and she was out there in the garden chatting with that young man. Looked like a scene from a soap opera. The lady and the hired hand." The other men laughed, thinking it was just another of Richard's provocations, but Edward didn't laugh. His jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the whiskey glass hard enough for his knuckles to turn white. He said nothing at that moment. He was not a man to make scenes. But something inside him broke. A fine, almost imperceptible crack, but one that would begin to spread like spiderwebs on shattered glass. After the guests left, Edward went up to the bedroom. Helen was already in bed reading a book. He entered and stood at the door watching her. For a moment, she looked up and smiled. A tired but sincere smile. "Good night," she said. "Did the dinner go well?" Edward just nodded without answering. He changed his clothes and lay down on the opposite side of the bed, his back to her. Helen sighed softly and returned to her book. Another night of silence. But in Edward's mind, the silence had been replaced by a constant buzzing. Richard's words echoed. The lady and the hired hand looked like a scene from a soap opera. He began to mentally review the last few months. How many times had Helen mentioned Matthew? How many times had he seen her talking to the young man? Was there something he hadn't noticed? Edward, who had always prided himself on his analytical skills, his ability to identify threats before they materialized, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: insecurity. In the following days, he began to watch. Discreetly, but with obsessive attention. He noticed that Helen did indeed talk to Matthew. Nothing extraordinary. Comments about the garden, about the weather, about necessary repairs in the house. But for a man whose trust was already shaken, even the most innocent of dialogues seemed suspicious. Edward started coming home earlier, unannounced. He invented excuses to pass by the garden. He watched from his office window. Helen noticed the change. Edward was more present, but not in the way she had always wished. There was something unsettling about his presence. A look that was not of affection, but of surveillance. She tried to talk to him. She asked if everything was all right, if there was a problem with the business. Edward answered vaguely, evasively. Just tired, he would say. But Helen had known this man for almost 30 years. She knew when something was bothering him. What she didn't know was the extent of what was forming in his mind. Edward, driven by a toxic mix of wounded pride and insecurity, began to construct a narrative in his own head. Maybe Helen was tired of him. Maybe she sought in Matthew the attention he didn't give her. Maybe those innocent conversations were just the tip of something bigger. There was no evidence, there was no proof. But for a man accustomed to controlling everything, the mere possibility of being deceived was intolerable. Edward began to withdraw even more, not out of disinterest, but as a distorted strategy of self-protection. If she was emotionally betraying him, then he would not allow himself to be vulnerable. He stopped having dinner at home. He started traveling frequently again, responding with monosyllables when Helen tried to talk, and the more he pulled away, the more she retreated. A vicious cycle fed by a lack of communication. It was during one of Edward's trips that Helen, in a moment of profound loneliness, did something she had never imagined doing. She called her best friend Beatrice, and for the first time in years, she cried. She broke down. She told her about the distance, the emptiness, the feeling of being invisible in her own home. Beatrice, who had known Helen since they were teenagers, was furious. She tried to convince her to confront Edward, to demand answers. But Helen had no strength for fights. She just wanted to understand what had happened to the man who had once loved her. When Edward returned from that trip, he brought a gift, a very expensive diamond bracelet. Helen thanked him politely, but they both knew it meant nothing. It was Edward's way of showing care without having to be emotionally present. Helen put the bracelet in a drawer and never wore it. The weeks turned into months. The silent tension between them was palpable. The household staff noticed, though no one dared to comment. Matthew, who happened to be at the center of it all without even knowing, began to avoid Helen. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he felt his presence was causing some kind of discomfort. And he was right. Edward watched him with a restrained hatred that made no sense. Hatred not for what Matthew had done, but for what Edward imagined he might represent. One afternoon, Edward summoned Matthew to his office. The young man entered nervously, thinking he was about to be fired. Edward stared at him for a long time in silence, as if trying to decipher some hidden secret. Finally he asked, his voice cold and controlled, "Do you talk to my wife?" Matthew swallowed hard. "Only when necessary, sir, about the work in the garden." Edward didn't look away. "Only about work?" "Yes, sir," Matthew replied, confused and frightened. Edward dismissed him with a wave of his hand, but the conversation made it clear that something was deeply wrong. That night, Helen found Edward in his office. He was hunched over his desk, looking at documents he didn't seem to be really reading. She knocked lightly on the door. "May I come in?" He nodded, but didn't look up. Helen entered and sat in the chair across from his desk. "We need to talk, Edward." He finally looked at her. "About what?" His voice was neutral, but his gaze was distant. "About us," Helen replied, her voice trembling slightly. "About what's happening between us." Edward leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Nothing is happening. We're just living our lives." Helen felt tears welling up, but she held them back. "This isn't living, Edward. This is just existing." He didn't answer. He just continued to look at her with that impenetrable expression he had perfected over the years. Helen waited for a word, a gesture, any sign that there was still something between them. But silence was the only answer she received. She stood up, defeated. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "I never cheated on you, Edward. Never. If that's what you're thinking." He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Helen closed the door behind her and walked slowly to her room. Her hands were shaking. Something inside her had changed that night. A decision that had not yet taken shape, but was beginning to solidify. Edward remained alone in his office for hours. Helen's words echoed. "I never cheated on you." But how could he be sure? How could anyone be sure of anything in this world? He had built an empire based on contracts, on guarantees, on clauses that protected his interests. But marriage had no clauses. Love had no guarantees. And this lack of control terrified him more than any financial risk. It was on that night that Edward made the decision that would seal both their fates. If he couldn't trust words, he would have to create a situation that would reveal the truth. A test. Something that would force Helen to show who she really was. The idea was twisted, cruel in its essence, but Edward's mind was already distorted by suspicion. He would spend the next few days planning meticulously. He didn't know. Yet that on the other side of that silent equation, Helen had also begun to draw up her own plans. The Upper East Side mansion, which had once housed love and hope, was now just a stage where two actors prepared for a performance neither of them really wanted to enact, but which both felt was inevitable. Chapter 2. The days that followed were marked by a tension that seemed to have a life of its own. It hung over the mansion like a dense fog, invisible to the eye, but felt in every breath. Edward delved even deeper into his business. But now it wasn't just an obsession with work, it was an escape. Every meeting, every contract, every trip was a way to avoid facing what was festering inside him. Suspicion had settled in like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Helen, for her part, continued her routine with the discipline of someone who learns to survive on hostile ground. She woke up early, had coffee alone on the back porch, where she could hear the birds singing and feel the morning sun warm her face. Then she would go about her activities. She continued to volunteer at a literacy project in the Bronx. It was 3 times a week, and those hours with the children were her only true respite. There, she wasn't the millionaire's wife. She wasn't Mrs. Travers. She was just Helen, the teacher who taught with patience and listened with attention. But even in those moments of peace, the shadow of what was happening at home pursued her. The children would ask why she seemed sad. Helen would smile and make excuses. "Just tired, sweetie. Nothing a good rest won't fix." But the fatigue she felt wasn't the kind that sleep could cure. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying an emotional weight that grew heavier each day. It was during one of those afternoons at the social project that Helen met Renata. She was a psychologist who had been hired by the organization to provide emotional support to the families of the children they served. Renata was in her early 40s, with graying hair she didn't bother to dye, and a gaze that seemed to see beyond words. In the first few weeks, they exchanged only polite greetings, but there was something about Renata that conveyed safety. Perhaps it was the way she listened to people, without judgment, without haste. One day, after a particularly difficult meeting with a mother going through a delicate situation, Helen stayed behind to help organize materials. Renata was also there, making notes in her notebook. Noticing they were alone, she turned to Helen. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but the way it was asked, with genuine concern, disarmed Helen. She opened her mouth to give the automatic reply she always gave, but the words wouldn't come out. Her eyes filled with tears. Renata approached and gently touched Helen's arm. "You don't have to. Talk now if you don't want to, but know that I'm here if you ever need it." Helen nodded, quickly wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she managed to murmur. And in that moment, something shifted. Renata would become, in the following weeks, a confidant. Not a close friend, but someone with whom Helen could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. Meanwhile, in the Upper East Side mansion, rumors began to take shape. They weren't public rumors, not yet. They were whispers among the staff, conversations that stopped when someone approached. Glances exchanged when Edward passed through the hallways with a somber expression. Even without fully understanding what was happening, everyone felt that something was wrong. Carmen, the cook who had worked at the house for over 15 years, was the first to notice concrete changes. Edward had given specific instructions that she no longer serve meals in the main dining room. He wanted to eat in his office, alone. As for Helen, who had always been sociable and kind, she now seemed withdrawn. She would offer thanks with smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Carmen, who had 6 children and knew the signs of a marriage in crisis, just shook her head in silence. She knew it wasn't her place to interfere, but it hurt to see them like this. It was Gloria, the cleaning lady who worked at the mansion 3 times a week, who inadvertently fueled the rumors that Edward already suspected. Gloria was a talkative woman, always had a story to tell, always knew everything that was happening in the neighborhood. One day, while cleaning Edward's office when he was in an external meeting, she commented casually to Carmen that she had seen the lady of the house talking with Matthew in the garden for the 3rd time that week. "There's nothing to it," Carmen replied, impatient with the gossip. "She's always been kind to everyone." Gloria shrugged. I know. But don't you think it's strange? A man like Mr. Edward, always busy, and she's there so alone, and Matthew is a handsome, hard-working young man." Carmen cut her off firmly. "I'm not going to listen to this kind of talk. Mrs. Helen is a respectable woman." Gloria raised her hands in surrender. Okay, I'm just saying what I saw." The problem was that Gloria didn't keep that conversation just between herself and Carmen. In the following days, she mentioned it to Mr. Anthony, the retired driver who still came to the mansion occasionally to help with repairs on Edward's car. She mentioned it to Nancy, the housekeeper who came on Saturdays. And like all gossip, the words became distorted, gaining weight and insinuations that didn't originally exist. By the time they reached Edward's ears, they had transformed into something much darker than they were. Edward overheard by chance. He was in the hallway leading to the garage when he heard voices. He recognized Gloria's voice and Nancy's. They were talking quietly, but not quietly enough. "They say she spends a lot of time with that gardener," Gloria was saying. "I don't know what the mister thinks about that. If it were me, I'd keep an eye on them." Edward felt his blood boil. He continued walking as if he hadn't heard anything, but every word had embedded itself in his mind like a thorn. From that moment on, Edward made a decision that would prove fatal to what was left of his marriage. He decided to document. He began to pay obsessive attention to Helen's schedule. He noted when she left, when she returned, who she spoke to. He started discreetly checking her phone when she was in the shower. He found nothing. No suspicious messages, no strange calls. But the absence of evidence didn't calm him. It only convinced him that Helen was being careful. It was then that Edward did something he had never imagined doing. He hired a private investigator, not a common detective, but someone discreet, recommended by a business colleague who had gone through a complicated divorce. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Sergio, came to the mansion disguised as a security consultant. Edward received him in his office and got straight to the point. "I want you to follow my wife. Discreetly. I want to know who she meets, where she goes, what she does, and most importantly, I want to know about her relationship with one of the household employees." Sergio, accustomed to this type of request, simply nodded. He asked a few technical questions, set his fee, and left the mansion without arousing suspicion. For the next 15 days, he followed Helen. He took photographs, he recorded, he documented every move. And at the end of that period, he returned to Edward's office with a full report. The report contained nothing incriminating. Helen followed her usual routine. She went to the social project 3 times a week. She sometimes had lunch with Beatrice, her longtime friend. She visited her mother, who lived in a comfortable apartment that Edward had bought for her years ago. She went shopping, to the beauty salon, attended a few meetings of a book club. No secret meetings, no suspicious behavior. The conversations with Matthew were always in broad daylight, always about matters related to the garden or house maintenance, but Edward was not satisfied. When Sergio handed over the report, Edward leafed through it with an increasingly dark expression. And the conversations with the employee. Sergio took a deep breath. Mr. Travers, there is absolutely nothing inappropriate in the interactions between your wife and the gardener. They are brief conversations, always professional. Edward slammed the report on the desk. Then why is everyone in the house talking about it? Sergio chose his words carefully. With all due respect, sir, rumors are not always based on fact. Sometimes people misinterpret innocent situations. Edward dismissed Sergio, but he couldn't let the matter go. The lack of proof didn't convince him. In his mind, distorted by suspicion, it only meant that Helen was too smart to be caught. He began to devise a plan. If he couldn't find proof of what he suspected, he would create a situation that would force the truth to come out. A test, but not just any test. Something that would reveal not only actions but intentions, something that would show Helen's true character. While Edward planned in secret, Helen was making her own decisions. After another conversation with Renata, the psychologist from the social project, she began to see her situation more clearly. Renata never told Helen what to do. She just asked questions that led her to reflect. Have you ever spoken openly with your husband about how you feel? Helen admitted she hadn't. Why? Helen couldn't answer immediately. Perhaps because she was afraid of the answer she would receive, or perhaps because deep down she already knew what that answer would be. Helen began to realize she was living in an invisible prison. She wasn't a prisoner of Edward, but of her own hope. The hope that one day he would return to being the man he once was, that the distance between them was temporary, that the love they once shared still existed somewhere just dormant. But how long can one live on hope? How long can one wait for someone who is no longer truly present? It was on a Tuesday night, after another solitary dinner, Helen in her room, Edward in his office, that Helen made a decision. She took out a new blue hardcover notebook and began to write. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a record. She wrote down the date and began to document her routine, her feelings, Edward's absences, the silences that filled the house. She didn't know exactly why she was doing it. Maybe it was a way to make sense of the chaos she felt. Or maybe, on some subconscious level, she was preparing for what was to come. That same week, Helen did something else she had never imagined doing. She consulted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the Travers family's own lawyer. Marcus Cole was a man in his early 60s, a partner at one of the most respected firms in New York. He had known Edward for over 20 years, handling all his legal affairs. But he also knew Helen, and over the years he had developed a genuine respect for her. When Helen called to schedule a meeting, Marcus was surprised. She had never sought his services directly. They arranged to meet on a Thursday afternoon at his office on Park Avenue. Helen arrived punctually, dressed discreetly but elegantly. Marcus received her in his private office and offered coffee. After his secretary left and closed the door, he sat across from Helen and waited. Helen didn't beat around the bush. Mr. Cole, I need to know what my rights are, in case I decide to get a separation. The words came out more firmly than she expected. Marcus showed no surprise. He had seen many marriages fall apart throughout his career. He asked some practical questions about assets, about the marriage regime, community of property, about how long they had been together. Helen answered everything calmly. I'm not saying I'm going to separate, she explained. I just want to understand my situation. in case it becomes necessary. Marcus was honest with her. He explained that given the length of the marriage and the regime chosen at the time, Helen would be entitled to half of the assets acquired during the marriage. It was a substantial amount, although Helen had never worried about that. Marcus also warned her about the challenges. "Edward is not a man who handles loss well," he said, choosing his words carefully. "If it comes to that, it will be a difficult process." Helen nodded. "I know. That's why I came to you first. I wanted to understand before making any decisions." Before she left, Marcus asked a question that surprised her. "May I give you some advice? Not as a lawyer, but as someone who has known you both for a long time." Helen agreed. "Try to talk. Really talk. Without masks. Without pride. Sometimes people get lost because they stop communicating. And when communication ends, everything else falls apart." Helen thanked him and left the office with much to think about. But while Helen sought clarity about her future, Edward was sinking deeper into his obsession. He began to make changes around the house, small things that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. He asked the security team to review all the cameras on the property. Officially, it was for security reasons, but his real intention was to have access to all the recordings. He wanted to be able to review every movement, every interaction, every second of what happened in that house. The cameras had been installed years ago, after a break-in at a neighboring mansion. They covered the entire exterior of the property, the garage, the entrances, and some internal corridors. But not the bedrooms or bathrooms, of course. Edward spent nights reviewing old recordings. He was looking for something, anything, that would confirm his suspicions. And although he found nothing compromising, every innocent conversation between Helen and Matthew was interpreted through the distorted lens of his suspicion. Matthew, who continued to do his job with dedication, began to feel the pressure. Edward watched him constantly. He would ask seemingly casual questions about the garden that seemed to carry insinuations. Matthew was confused and scared. He spoke to Carmen about it. "I think I'm going to be fired," he said, his voice worried. "I don't know what I did wrong." Carmen, who was tired of the whole situation, was direct with him. "You didn't do anything wrong, Matthew. But it would be better for you to keep your distance. Don't talk much to anyone for now, just do your job and go home." Matthew agreed, not fully understanding but trusting her advice. Matthew's withdrawal should have calmed Edward, but it had the opposite effect. To him, it was further proof of guilt. Why was the young man suddenly pulling away? Obviously because he knew he was being watched. Edward's mind created narratives where there were none. It was a vicious cycle of paranoia feeding on itself. It was on a Saturday night that everything began to accelerate toward the inevitable. Edward was in his office, as usual, when Helen knocked on the door. She entered without waiting for a response, which was unusual. Her face was tired but determined. "We need to talk, Edward, for real this time." He looked at her with that neutral expression she detested so much. "About what?" "About us," she replied, sitting down uninvited. "About what happened to our marriage." Edward leaned back in his chair, his fingers intertwined in his lap. "What do you want me to say, Helen?" She took a deep breath. "I want you to be honest with me. What is going on? Why are you so distant? Why do you look at me as if I'm a stranger?" Edward was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was a thread of accusation in it. "Maybe because I don't know who you are anymore." Helen felt as if she had been punched. "What do you mean?" Edward leaned forward. "People talk, Helen. They say things, and I watch. I watch you talking to the staff, smiling at them in a way you haven't smiled at me in years." Helen felt anger rising. "What exactly are you accusing me of? Just say it." Edward didn't answer directly. He just looked at her with that cold gaze she no longer recognized. "I just want to be sure I can still trust you." Helen stood up, her hands shaking. 30 years, Edward. 30 years by your side. And you doubt me now? Because of gossip? Because of polite conversations with people who work in our home? He stood up too. "It's not about the conversations, Helen. It's about respect, about loyalty, about being sure that what we built together still means something to you." "It does," Helen replied, her voice breaking. "It always has. But I can't live like this. I can't live being watched, being judged, being treated as if I'm guilty of something I never did." Edward didn't respond. He just continued to look at her with that impenetrable expression. Helen waited for a moment, hoping he would say something, anything to indicate there was still a chance to save what they had. But the silence was deafening. Helen left the office with a shattered heart. She went up to her room and for the first time in years, locked the door. She sat on the bed and cried. She cried for the loss of the man she had loved. She cried for the years she had given to a marriage that no longer existed. She cried for the loneliness she felt, even in a house full of rooms. And when the tears finally dried, something inside her changed for good. She opened the drawer of her bedside table and took out the blue notebook. She began to write. She wrote about that conversation, about the veiled accusations, about Edward's gaze. She wrote about how she felt. And for the first time, she wrote about what she was planning to do. It wasn't a complete plan yet, just the beginning of an idea. But it was a start. Edward, on the other side of the house, was also making decisions. He had decided that words were not enough. He needed concrete proof, and if he couldn't find it, he would create a situation that would reveal the truth. He began to draw up his plan that very night, a plan that in his distorted mind made perfect sense, but which in reality would be the final nail in the coffin of a marriage that had long been on its deathbed. The majestic and silent Upper East Side mansion now housed two broken hearts that had forgotten how to speak to each other, two plans being architected separately, and a fate that was approaching inevitably, like a storm whose signs everyone ignored until it was too late. Chapter 3. Spring had arrived in New York City, bringing with it that typical golden afternoon light that made the city seem less harsh. The cherry blossoms bloomed in the parks, painting the sidewalks pink. It was a season of rebirth, but inside the Upper East Side mansion, something was dying slowly, day by day, silence by silence. Edward had chosen a Friday to execute his plan. It was not a random choice. He knew that on that day, Helen wouldn't have her usual commitments at the social project, that the staff would leave early, that they would be completely alone in the house. It was the perfect setting for what he planned to do. A night when he would finally have the answers he sought. During the week, Edward prepared meticulously. He sent Carmen on an extended leave, a rare occurrence, justifying that she deserved a rest. He dismissed the other staff members early, saying that he and Helen needed privacy to discuss personal matters. He made sure the security cameras were working perfectly. Every detail was calculated with the same precision with which he conducted his business. Helen noticed that something was different. Edward was home at dinner time, something that hadn't happened in months. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't decipher. When she came down to the living room around 7 in the evening, she found Edward sitting in one of the armchairs, staring intently at the unlit fireplace. He was wearing slacks and a dress shirt, but he seemed different, tenser, darker. "Good evening," she said, trying to keep her voice normal. Edward turned his face slowly towards her. "We need to talk," he said, and there was something definitive in his tone. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. "Sit down." She obeyed, choosing the farthest armchair. The silence between them was thick. Finally, Edward spoke. "I did something you might not approve of, but I need answers, Helen. I need to know the truth." She stared at him, confused. "The truth about what?" Edward stood up and walked to the window. "For the past few months I've been watching you. I've been paying attention to every move, every conversation, every time you went out." Helen felt anger begin to boil. "You spied on me." Edward turned around. "I protected my interests, as I've always done." She stood up too, her hands trembling. "Your interests? I'm your wife, Edward, not one of your business deals." He ignored her remark. "Tonight," he said, approaching her, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want honest answers. No beating around the bush, no half-truths." Helen crossed her arms. "I have always been honest with you, always." But Edward didn't seem to be listening. He went to the office adjacent to the living room and returned carrying a wooden box. It was an old hand-carved box that Helen recognized. Edward had kept it for years, always locked in a drawer of his private office. He placed the box on the coffee table with a thud that seemed to echo through the empty room. "Do you know what's in here?" Helen shook her head, though something inside her knew she didn't want to find out. Edward opened the box slowly, almost ritually. Inside, Helen saw letters. Her letters. The ones she had written to Edward in the early years of their marriage when he traveled a lot. Letters full of love, longing, and hope. Letters he never answered but had apparently kept. Besides the letters, there were photographs. Photos from their wedding. Photos from trips they took together in the early years. But they were all torn in half, carefully separating the two of them. Edward on one side, Helen on the other. The symbolism was cruel and deliberate. At the bottom of the box, there was something that made Helen's heart race. The wedding ring she had given him, broken in half, a clean, precise cut made intentionally. Helen felt tears burn her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What is this, Edward?" He closed the box again. "It's an inventory of everything we built together and everything that was lost. And tonight, you're going to explain why. Why we got here. Why you betrayed me." Helen took a step forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "I never betrayed you. Never. How can you believe I would do that?" Edward stared at her coldly. "Then explain the conversations with the gardener. Explain why the staff gossips about you. Explain why you smile at him in a way you haven't smiled at me in years." Helen felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath her feet. "This is ridiculous. I talked to Matthew about the garden, about repairs to the house. They're 30-second conversations. And as for smiling, Edward, how do you expect me to smile at you when you've barely looked at me for months?" But Edward wasn't interested in listening. He was interested in confirming what he already believed. "Tonight," he said, "we're going to settle this once and for all. You're going to tell me the truth about your relationship with that man. You're going to tell me if you still love me or if this," he gestured to the room, to the house, to everything that surrounded them, "is just a convenient charade." Helen felt something break inside her. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a mixture of anger, indignation, and, strangely, a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at Edward, at the man she had once loved, and saw a stranger. "You want to know the truth?" Her voice came out firmer than she expected. "The truth is that you destroyed our marriage all by yourself, with your obsession, with your suspicion, with your inability to see that I was always here by your side trying to make this work." Edward clenched his jaw. "Don't try to turn this around. I'm not the one being accused here." Helen gave a bitter laugh. "Aren't you? Then why do I feel like a criminal in my own home? Why do I have to justify every conversation, every smile, every move?" Edward moved closer to her, and for the first time, Helen felt something she had never felt near him. Fear. Not physical fear, but fear of what he was capable of doing, emotionally. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to the sofa. Helen hesitated but obeyed. She felt ridiculous, sitting there like a student being reprimanded. Edward stood, dominating the space, and began to ask questions, detailed questions about her days, about her conversations with Matthew, about every interaction he had documented in his distorted mind. Helen answered each one with a patience she didn't know she still possessed. But with each answer, it became clearer that nothing she said would make a difference. Edward didn't want answers. He wanted a confession to something that had never happened, and when he realized he wouldn't get that confession through questions, he changed tactics. He began to show her the evidence he had collected. He had printed frames from the security cameras showing Helen talking to Matthew. Completely innocent images that he interpreted as suspicious. He showed reports of her schedule, her movements, all documented with the obsession of someone who had lost touch with reality. Helen looked at it all with a mixture of horror and sadness. "This is the man I trusted my life with," she thought. "This is the man who swore to love and protect me, and now he's treating me like a suspect in a trial where there is no jury, only a judge who has already decided my fate." When Edward finished his presentation of evidence, He looked at her, expecting a reaction. Helen simply shook her head. "You're sick, Edward. Not physically, but emotionally. You need help." He reacted as if he had been slapped. "I need help? I'm not the one lying here." Helen stood up, determined not to continue this absurd charade. "I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. I won't submit to this ridiculous interrogation." She made a move to leave the room, but Edward blocked her path. "We're not finished." It was at that moment that something changed in Helen's expression. The tears that had threatened to fall dried up. The fear transformed into something different, a strange, almost unsettling calm. She looked into Edward's eyes and said, with a voice that seemed to come from someone she didn't know, "You want to know the truth, Edward? The truth is, I knew this was going to happen." Edward frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Helen took a few steps back, creating distance between them. "I knew you were planning something. For the past few weeks I've been watching you. I saw you checking the cameras, dismissing the staff, acting strangely, and I prepared myself." The confusion on Edward's face turned into something darker. "Prepared how?" Helen picked up her purse, which was on a chair, and took out an envelope. She gave the envelope to Edward, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were documents, copies of logs from the security cameras from the last 3 months. But they weren't the images Edward had seen. They were others. Images of him obsessively reviewing the recordings, of him following Helen around the house, of him talking to the private investigator at the property entrance, all documented, all time-stamped. "How did you get this?" Edward asked, his voice weaker than he intended. Helen crossed her arms. "The cameras you had installed years ago? You forgot they also record who is watching them, and you forgot that I have access to the same systems you do. I spent the last few weeks copying everything, every moment of your obsession, documented." Edward looked at the documents, then at Helen, then back at the documents. His mind tried to process what was happening. "You were spying on me." Helen gave a humorless laugh. "Just like you were spying on me. The difference, Edward, is that I was right to be suspicious, because you really were plotting something against me, whereas I never did anything but be your faithful wife." But there was more. Helen took another envelope from her purse. This one was larger, bulkier. "This one," she said, "is a journal. I started writing a few weeks ago, after I realized our marriage was over. In it is everything. Every day you ignored me. Every anniversary you forgot. Every time you chose work over. Every cold look, every harsh word, it's all recorded, with dates, details, and witnesses when applicable." Edward sat down heavily on the sofa, still holding the documents. "Why did you do this?" His voice was almost a whisper. Helen sat in the chair opposite him, maintaining the distance. "Because I needed to know how far you would go. I needed to be sure that the man I loved really didn't exist anymore. And tonight, you gave me that certainty. With your ridiculous test, with your unfounded accusations, with this pathetic box full of broken symbols, you gave me the confirmation that it's over." The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't a tense silence, but an empty one, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Edward looked at Helen as if seeing her for the first time, or perhaps as if seeing her for the last. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, and there was something that could have been fear in his voice. Helen took a deep breath. "Tomorrow morning I'm leaving this house. I'll stay at my mother's for now. I've already spoken with Mr. Cole. He's preparing the separation papers." Edward felt the ground disappear. "Marcus, my lawyer?" Helen nodded. "He told me to try talking to you first, to try to resolve this before it gets to the courts. But after tonight, I don't think there's anything left to resolve, is there?" Edward tried to process it all. "You can't do this." Helen stood up. "Yes, I can, and I will. You have 2 options, Edward. We can do this civilly, dividing the assets according to the law, without scandal, without a long process. Or we can do it the hard way, and I can take all of this," she pointed to the envelopes, "to the press, to everyone who has ever admired you. Let them see who you've really become." It was a threat, but not an empty one. Edward knew Helen had the means to do what she said. and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't experienced since adolescence: impotence. "I've always controlled everything," he thought. "I've always held the cards. How did I let this happen? How did I not realize she was 3 steps ahead?" Helen picked up her purse and walked towards the stairs. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. At 9 tomorrow, the lawyers will be here to discuss the next steps. I suggest you think carefully about how you want this to proceed." Edward sat motionless, listening to her footsteps go up the stairs. When the sound faded, he looked at the wooden box on the table, the box he had prepared so carefully, thinking it would be his final weapon. Now it just seemed pathetic. He picked up one of the letters Helen had written so many years ago. He opened it and began to read. The words were full of love, hope, and an innocence he had systematically destroyed over the years. "My love." The letter began, "It's been 3 months since you've been away, and I miss you so much it's like a physical pain. But I know you're building our future, so I wait patiently. I love you more than words can say." Edward felt something wet on his face and realized he was crying. He hadn't cried in decades. He had been proud of that, of his ability to keep his emotions in check. But that night, alone in that immense room, surrounded by the wreckage of a marriage he himself had sabotaged, the tears fell freely. They weren't tears of regret yet. They were tears of anger. Anger at Helen for being 3 steps ahead. Anger at himself for not realizing. Anger at the world for not working the way he wanted it to. He spent the night in his office, sleepless. He mentally reviewed every step he had taken in recent months, every decision, every suspicion, every moment of paranoia, and he realized, with painful clarity, that he had created an enemy where none existed, that he had destroyed the only real thing he possessed in pursuit of a phantom of his own imagination. When the sun began to rise, painting the New York sky with shades of pink and orange, Edward was still sitting in the same position. He heard the sounds of the house waking up, the birds in the garden, the automatic gate opening for the newspaper delivery, and then the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Helen was standing there, dressed simply but elegantly. She had a small suitcase in her hand. "You're leaving already?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse from so much silence. Helen stopped at the living room door. "The lawyers arrive at 9, as I said. I'll wait at my mother's house. If you decide to cooperate, this can end quickly and discreetly. If you don't, well, you know the consequences." Edward nodded slowly. Everything had been carefully planned by her. He, who had always prided himself on being in control, had been completely outmaneuvered. "Can I ask you a question?" he said, as Helen was almost at the door. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Do you still love me?" The question came out more fragile than he intended. Helen was silent for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "I loved the man you were, Edward. But that man died a long time ago, and I can't live on memories anymore." And then she left. The door closed behind her with a definitive sound. Edward heard her car start, heard the gate open, heard the sound of the engine fading down the street. And then, silence. A silence that seemed to fill every corner of that enormous mansion. A silence that, for the first time in his life, Edward could not control or manipulate. He stood up with difficulty, as if he had aged 10 years in a single night. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden. Matthew was already there, working as always, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded the night before. An innocent young man who had become the center of a storm he didn't even know existed. Edward felt a pang of shame, but it was too late for that. He went up to the bedroom, the room he had shared with Helen for almost 30 years. Everything was tidy, impeccable, but something was missing. Life was missing. Helen was missing. He sat on the bed and picked up the phone. He called Marcus, his lawyer. When the man answered, Edward said only 5 words, "We'll do it her way," and hung up. It wasn't surrender, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, the beginning of understanding that he had lost, that his obsession with controlling and protecting what he had destroyed the very thing most worth protecting, the beginning of the realization that the test he had designed hadn't tested Helen. It had tested him, and he had failed miserably. The morning advanced. Over New York City. The city awoke to another day of traffic, of work, of lives moving forward. But inside the Upper East Side mansion, something had definitively ended. A chapter had closed, and what came next would be the consequence of choices that could no longer be undone. Chapter 4. The days following Helen's departure were marked by a flurry of activity that Edward had never imagined experiencing. Lawyers came and went from the mansion with voluminous briefcases, endless documents that needed to be signed, reviewed, filed. Marcus Cole coordinated everything with the efficiency of someone who had done for this dozens of times before. But there was something different in his gaze when he dealt with Edward now. It was no longer the unconditional respect of a service provider. It was something close to disappointment. Edward tried, in the first few days, to maintain his usual routine. He woke up early, had coffee alone on the porch that Helen had loved so much, then headed to his office. But concentration wouldn't come. The numbers on the spreadsheets didn't make sense. The meetings seemed to happen in slow motion, with distorted voices he could barely process. His partners began to notice. Richard Miles, the very man who had planted the first seed of doubt months ago, had the audacity to ask during a business lunch, "So, Edward, everything okay at home?" Edward stared at him with a look so cold that Richard nearly choked on his wine. "Never mention my personal life in front of me again," Edward said, his voice low but laden with threat. Richard nodded quickly and changed the subject. But the message had been received. Edward Travers was going through something, and no one should dare to comment on it in his presence. Helen, meanwhile, was at her mother's house in Brooklyn Heights. It was a comfortable upper-middle-class home, with a garden in the back and a quiet neighborhood. Martha, her mother, was 72 and still maintained her usual vivacity. When she saw her daughter arrive with a suitcase on that Saturday morning, she didn't ask questions. She just opened her arms and let Helen cry. Then she made fresh coffee, put some scones in the oven, and sat with her in the kitchen. "I want you to tell me everything," Martha said, holding her daughter's hand. "No rush, no shame, just you and me." "And," Helen told her. She told her about the last few months of suspicion, about the veiled accusations, about the night of the test. She told her about how she had prepared, about the documents she had collected, about the decision to leave. Martha listened in silence, and when Helen finished, she shook her head slowly. "I always thought there was something wrong with that marriage," she said. "A man who works so much, who is always absent. But I thought it was just his personality. I never imagined it would come to this," she paused. "Are you sure this is what you want, a permanent separation?" Helen nodded. "I am, Mom. I can't go back, not after everything that's happened." Martha squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then I support you. You've always been strong, Helen. Stronger than you know." In the following days, Helen began to reorganize her life. She called Beatrice, her longtime friend, and they arranged for lunch. Beatrice arrived at the restaurant with red eyes, clearly emotional. When she saw Helen, she stood up and hugged her tightly. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I just didn't think it would take so long. You put up with more than anyone should have to." Helen smiled sadly. "I needed to be sure, Bea. I needed to try everything before giving up." Beatrice was married to Julian, a successful doctor, and had 3 grown children. They had been friends since high school, when they studied together in Queens. Beatrice had been the maid of honor at Helen and Edward's wedding. She had witnessed the entire trajectory of their relationship. During lunch, Helen shared the details she hadn't yet disclosed. Beatrice listened with expressions that varied between anger and sadness. "That man has completely lost his mind," Beatrice said, when Helen finished. "Paranoia, pathological jealousy, obsession with control. That's not love, Helen. It never was." Helen listlessly poked at her salad. "I know. But there was a time when it was different. In the early years, he really did love me." Beatrice shook her head. "Or maybe he loved the idea of you, the idea of having something pure in his controlled life. But he never saw you as a whole person, with needs, with your own desires." Beatrice's words echoed in Helen's mind. Had Edward ever truly loved her? Or had she always been just another acquisition in his empire? Another symbol of success? The doubt hurt, but Helen had no more tears to shed. She had cried all she had to cry that first night at her mother's house. Meanwhile, in the Upper East Side mansion, Edward faced a reality he was not prepared to live. Loneliness. Not the momentary loneliness of a business trip or a night working late, but the profound loneliness of a house too big, too quiet, too empty. The staff continued their work, but there was something different in the air. Everyone knew, everyone had realized that Mrs. Travers would not be coming back. Carmen was the first to gather the courage to ask. She was preparing Edward's dinner on a Thursday night when he entered the kitchen, which was unusual. "Carmen," he said, and his voice came out more tired than he intended. "Yes, sir?" She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you know my wife was monitoring me?" The question caught Carmen by surprise. "I didn't know anything specific, sir," she answered honestly. "But I noticed that things hadn't been right for some time." Edward nodded slowly. "And the gardener, Matthew, did you ever see anything inappropriate between him and my wife?" Carmen felt anger rise. "With all due respect, Mr. Travers, I never saw anything wrong. Mrs. Helen has always been a respectable lady. She treated all of us with kindness. If there were conversations, they were just that, polite conversations." Edward left the kitchen without another word, but what Carmen said hammered in his head. Had he created an entire scenario in his mind? Was it possible his suspicion had absolutely no basis in reality? The possibility was terrifying because it meant he had destroyed his marriage on his own, with no help from anyone. It was on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Helen's departure, that Marcus arrived at the mansion with new documents. This time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by Dr. Patricia Allen, a divorce lawyer representing Helen. She was a woman in her 50s, her hair in a neat bun, wearing a discreet but elegant suit. Her gaze was firm and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Travers," she greeted as Edward received them in his office. "I'm Patricia Allen. I represent Helen Travers in this process." Edward nodded, shaking her hand with more force than necessary, as if trying to establish dominance. "Please, sit." The three of them settled, Marcus and Patricia on one side of the desk, Edward on the other. The symbolism did not escape him. He was alone. Patricia opened her briefcase and took out a series of documents. "My client is proposing a fair and swift settlement," she said, getting straight to the point. "Community of property, as established in the marriage. She is not asking for alimony, only her legitimate share of the assets acquired during the marriage." Edward leafed through the documents. It was an extensive list. Real estate, investments, bank accounts, everything meticulously divided in half. "This is going to cost me a fortune," Edward said, his voice tense. Patricia looked at him without flinching. "This is what the law stipulates, Mr. Travers, and considering the circumstances, my client is being extremely generous." She could make this much more complicated. Edward looked at Marcus, seeking support, but the lawyer just confirmed with a nod. "It's true, Edward. She could ask for more, especially if she followed through on her threats to expose certain situations." Edward felt a knot tighten in his throat. The evidence Helen had collected, the recordings, the documents, the journal, all of it could be used against him, not legally perhaps, but socially. His reputation, which he had spent decades building, could be destroyed in days. The press would love a story about the paranoid millionaire who spied on his innocent wife. Competitors would use it against him. Investors would lose confidence. "I'll sign," Edward said finally, his voice defeated. "But I want it on record that I admit no fault, that it was a mutual decision." Patricia exchanged a look with Marcus. "We can work with that," she said, "as long as you cooperate fully and don't try to hinder the he's process." Edward nodded. The pages were turned, the signatures were placed. Each initial was like a cut. When they finished, Edward felt drained. After the lawyers left, Edward remained alone in his office for hours. He looked around. This space that had always been his sanctuary, his kingdom, now felt like a prison. The noble wood-paneled walls, the business books on the shelves, the framed diplomas and awards. It all seemed meaningless. He had won the world and lost what truly mattered. He picked up the phone and did something he hadn't done in years. He called his younger brother. Gus. They had grown distant after Edward became wealthy. Gus had remained in rural Georgia running a small hardware business. He had never accepted money from Edward, always saying he preferred his simple life. When Gus answered, his voice sounded surprised. "Edward, is that really you? It's been, what, 5 years since you last called?" "Hi, Gus," Edward said, and for the first time in decades his voice sounded vulnerable. "I need to talk to someone." There was a silence on the other end. Then Gus sighed. "All right, brother, I'm listening." And Edward told him. Not everything, but enough. About the separation, about how he had reached this point. When he finished, Gus gave a humorless laugh. "You've always been like this, man," he said, "always needing to control everything, since we were kids. Remember when you used to organize our toys in alphabetical order? When you made a list of everything we ate for breakfast? I thought it was funny back then. Now I see it was a sickness." Edward felt anger rise. "I didn't call to be insulted." Gus interrupted him. "It's not an insult, Edward, it's the truth. You built an empire but forgot to build a life, and now you're paying the price." The words hurt because they were true. Edward hung up shortly after, not knowing if he felt better or worse, but at least someone had been honest with him. In the days that followed, he began to notice other details he had always ignored. He realized he had no real friends, only business partners, that his social dinners were disguised transactions, that no one called to ask how he was, only to ask about investment opportunities. Helen, on the other hand, was rediscovering a lightness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was relief. Relief from no longer having to walk on eggshells in her own home, from not being constantly watched, from being able to breathe without feeling the weight of judgment. She started making plans. Plans that didn't involve Edward, that didn't depend on anyone's permission. She sought out Renata, the psychologist from the social project, and began therapy sessions. She needed to process everything she had lived through, to understand how she had reached this point. Renata was patient and kind, guiding Helen through the layers of pain, disappointment, but also of strength she didn't know, she possessed. "You survived," Renata would say, "and survival is already a victory." It was during one of these sessions that Helen made another important decision. "I'm going to travel," she said. "When all of this is officially over, when the papers are signed, I'm going to leave the US for a while. I need distance. I need to rediscover myself away from all this." Renata smiled. "I think that's an excellent idea. Where are you thinking of going?" Helen had done her research. Ireland, a country that spoke her language but was different enough to be a real change. Meanwhile, the separation process followed its bureaucratic course. Documents were exchanged, assets were inventoried, accounts were divided. Edward cooperated, as he had promised, but each step was a defeat. Each divided property, each separated account, was a concrete reminder that he had lost. And unlike in his business, where losing was temporary and there was always a next opportunity, this loss was final. It was on a Sunday afternoon, almost a month after the separation, that Edward did something unusual. He told Matthew to take the day off and asked Carmen to talk. They sat in the kitchen, which was bizarre in itself. The boss never sat in the kitchen with the staff. Carmen was visibly uncomfortable, but Edward seemed to genuinely want to talk. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words came out with difficulty, "for everything that happened, for suspecting things that didn't exist, for creating a bad environment here." Carmen was surprised. She didn't expect that. "Mr. Travers, He interrupted her gently. "Please, let me finish. I was wrong. Very wrong. And I destroyed my marriage because of my pride and my insecurity. You all saw it. And I want you to know that Helen never did anything wrong. Never." Carmen felt her eyes well up. "I always knew that, sir. Mrs. Helen is a wonderful person. You were lucky to have her." Edward nodded. "I was. Past tense. I don't have her anymore." They were silent for a moment. Then Edward stood up. Thank you for everything, Carmen, for taking care of this house, for being loyal all these years. She stood up too. I'll always be here, sir, if you need anything. But Edward knew he would need much more than Carmen could offer. He needed something money couldn't buy. He needed redemption, forgiveness, a second chance he knew wouldn't come. That night, alone in his room for the first time in almost 30 years, Edward Travers cried. He cried for the loss. He cried for the wasted years. He cried for the man he could have been, but chose not to be. And as he cried alone in his empty mansion, Helen was at her mother's house, lying in the small room that had been hers as a teenager, looking at the ceiling and making plans. Plans for travel, for a new beginning, for a life that would finally be hers alone. There was no joy yet, but there was hope. And sometimes hope is enough to take the first step towards healing. The official separation process would take a few more months. But the marriage had already ended on that Friday night, when Edward had set up his cruel test and Helen had revealed she was 3 steps ahead. Everything that came after was just bureaucracy, papers being signed, assets being divided, lives being officially separated on paper after they had already been emotionally separated for a long time. New York City continued its frantic routine outside the walls. The city didn't stop for broken hearts. It waited for no one. And perhaps that was what both Edward and Helen needed at that moment. Life moving forward, indifferent to their pain, reminding them that the world was bigger than their personal problems, that there would be a tomorrow, even when today seemed impossible to bear. Chapter 5. 3 months had passed since that fateful night. 3 months of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and the division of assets that had once represented a shared life. Helen had moved into a rented apartment in Greenwich Village, a more bohemian and less ostentatious neighborhood than the Upper East Side. It was a smaller, cozy place, with windows overlooking a tree-lined street where she could hear the sounds of life happening. Children playing, neighbors chatting, street musicians playing on weekends. It was noisy, vibrant, and completely different from the heavy silence of the mansion, and Helen loved every second of it. She continued her volunteer work at the social project, but now with more dedication. Without the obligation to keep up appearances at social events, without the need to be available for Edward's commitments, she had time. Time for herself. Time to do what really mattered. She had also started a literature course at NYU, something she had always wanted to do but never had the courage. At 52, she was one of the oldest students in the class. But she was happy. Edward, on the other hand, had plunged even deeper into work. It was his only way of dealing with the emptiness he felt. Meetings stretched late into the night. Business trips became more frequent. Anything to avoid returning to that empty mansion where every room screamed of Helen's absence. His partners began to worry. Richard Miles, in a moment of unusual courage, pulled Edward aside after a particularly tense meeting. "You need to slow down, man," Richard said. "You're working too much. You're going to end up with a serious health problem." Edward looked at him with that characteristic coldness. "Worried about my health or your dividends?" Richard sighed. "Both. You're not the same, Edward. Everyone sees it. You're different, more aggressive, making risky decisions. It's not good for you or for the company." Edward dismissed Richard with a wave of his hand, but the words lingered. Had he really changed? Or had he always been this way, and people simply tolerated it because he was successful? The difference now was that he no longer had Helen to come home to and pretend everything was fine. He no longer had that illusion of normalcy at home to compensate for the coldness of business. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 4 months after the separation, that everything began to unravel publicly. Edward was in a meeting when his secretary rushed in, something she never did. "Mr. Travers," she said, her voice nervous. "There's a situation. I need to speak with you urgently." Edward excused himself from the attendees and went out into the hallway with her. "What is it?" His secretary handed him a tablet. On the screen was the headline of one of New York's major news portals. "Millionaire Edward Travers, accused of spying on wife over unfounded jealousy. Divorce exposes years of a controlling relationship." Edward felt his blood run cold. He clicked on the article and began to read. The text was too detailed, too precise. It mentioned the security cameras, the private investigator, even the box with the torn letters and photos. There were quotes from anonymous sources close to the couple. And although Helen was not mentioned as a source, it was obvious the information came from someone very well informed. But the worst part wasn't the text, it was the images. There were screenshots of legal documents, obviously leaked from somewhere. And there were photos taken from the security cameras of the mansion itself, showing Edward obsessively reviewing the recordings, following Helen through the hallways, confronting Matthew. The images were just blurry enough not to be absolutely conclusive, but clear enough to tell a story. The story of an obsessed, paranoid man destroying his own marriage. How did this get to the press? Edward practically yelled at his secretary. She recoiled, frightened. "I don't know, sir, it just came out. It's on all the portals now." Edward immediately called Marcus. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "I've seen it," he said, before Edward could even speak. "I'm trying to find the source of the leak. But Edward, we need to talk about crisis management. This could destroy your reputation." In the minutes that followed, Edward's phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists wanting interviews, worried partners, investors demanding explanations. The board of directors of one of the companies he chaired called an emergency meeting. Everything was falling apart, and Edward couldn't process the speed at which it was happening. Helen learned of the news through Beatrice, who called in a panic. "Have you seen what's coming out about Edward?" Helen, who was at the university between classes, picked up her phone and opened the link Beatrice sent. She read the article with a neutral expression. She said nothing for a long moment. "I didn't do this," she finally said. "I didn't leak anything." Beatrice believed her immediately. "I know, but someone did. And it's causing a huge scandal." Helen hung up and stared at her phone screen. Part of her felt a bitter satisfaction. Edward was finally facing public consequences for his actions. But another part, the part that still held remnants of the love she had once felt, was sad. This wasn't how she wanted things to end, not with public humiliation, with media exposure. She just wanted to move on quietly and discreetly, but the genie was already out of the bottle. In the following hours, other publications picked up the story. Society columnists, who had always praised the Travers couple as a symbol of success and elegance, now wrote analytical articles about abusive relationships disguised as love. Psychologists were interviewed, talking about controlling behavior. The story grew to proportions no one expected. Edward tried to do damage control. His press office issued an official statement denying the accusations, saying the separation had been amicable and that the published information was a malicious distortion of reality. But the statement came too late and sounded too defensive. No one believed it, especially after photos of Helen appeared, showing a serene, discreet woman working with underprivileged children. The contrast with the image of the paranoid millionaire was devastating. The impact on his business was immediate. Two major investors announced they were re-evaluating their partnerships. A company where Edward was a board member asked for his resignation, claiming his presence was bringing negative publicity. The stock of one of his main companies fell 12% in 2 days. The financial market does not forgive personal scandals, especially when they involve business leaders. Edward locked himself in the mansion for days. He didn't answer calls, didn't reply to emails. He let his lawyers and his PR team handle the chaos, but there wasn't much they could do. The story had all the elements the media loved: wealth, power, emotional betrayal, a sympathetic victim. And the more Edward tried to defend himself, the worse it got. It was Gus, his brother, who finally managed to speak with him. He showed up at the mansion unannounced, simply ringing the doorbell insistently until Edward answered. When he opened the door and saw his brother standing there, Edward's last defense crumbled. Gus entered, closed the door, and hugged his brother. Edward, who hadn't hugged anyone in decades, who always maintained physical distance even from family, broke down in his younger brother's arms. They sat in the living room, the same room, where Edward had set up his cruel test months ago. Gus didn't ask invasive questions. He just sat there, present. After a long silence, Edward began to talk. He told him everything. From Richard's initial comment that planted the seed of doubt to the fateful night of the confrontation, he told him about how Helen had been 3 steps ahead, about the documents, about everything, and he confessed something he hadn't even admitted to himself until that moment. "I loved her, Gus. I really did. But I didn't know how to show it. I didn't know how to be vulnerable. And when I felt I might lose her instead of getting closer, I attacked. I created imaginary enemies. I destroyed the only real thing I had." Gus listened to it all in silence. When Edward finished, he took a deep breath. "You need professional help, brother. Therapy. It's not a shame, it's necessary." Edward nodded. He knew his brother was right. While Edward faced the public consequences of his actions, Helen was making a decision that had been maturing for weeks. After long conversations with her mother and Beatrice, she bought a one-way ticket to Dublin. She wasn't running away, she told herself. She was starting over. Ireland offered a mild climate, a familiar language, and enough distance from the circus her life had become in the States. She communicated her decision to only a few people. Renata, her therapist, fully supported it. "I think it's exactly what you need," she said in their last session before the trip. "A complete fresh start, away from everything that has hurt you." Martha cried, but they were tears of pride. "My daughter has always been brave," she said. "Go and be happy. I'll be right here." Beatrice promised to visit as soon as she was settled. Helen didn't tell Edward. She didn't think it was necessary. The divorce was practically finalized, with only a few final signatures left for the lawyers to handle. She owed him no explanations. But on the night before her departure, while packing her bags in her Greenwich Village apartment, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about all the years with Edward, the good times, which had truly existed at the beginning, and the bad years, which had stretched on for so long. There was no hatred, no resentment, just a melancholic sadness for the loss of what could have been. Edward wasn't a bad man, she concluded. He was a wounded man incapable of dealing with his own insecurities, who ended up hurting the one who loved him most. He was pathetic in his humanity, and Helen, after all those months of processing everything, could finally see that with clarity and compassion, even from a distance. The news that Helen was leaving the country leaked a few days after her departure, another headline in the papers. Millionaire's ex-wife moves to Ireland after divorce scandal. Edward found out through Marcus, who had received a letter, from her formalizing her move and providing a new address for legal correspondence. He held the letter for a long time, looking at her handwriting. It was final. She had really moved on. Edward started therapy, as Gus had suggested. It was difficult at first. Opening up, talking about feelings, admitting vulnerabilities. It all went against his nature. But the therapist, a man in his 60s named Dr. Roberts, was patient and direct. He wasn't afraid to confront Edward, to point out his destructive patterns. And slowly, very slowly, Edward began to understand what he had done. It wasn't a process of weeks or months, it was years. Years of deconstructing behaviors he had cultivated for decades. Years of learning that control is not security, that suspicion is not protection, that vulnerability is not weakness. It was painful. Many times Edward wanted to give up, to go back to his old ways of dealing with the world, but something kept him in therapy. Perhaps it was the glimpse that he could become a better person, or perhaps it was simply not wanting to end up completely alone. Professionally, it took time for his reputation to recover. Some deals were lost permanently. Partnerships were dissolved. But Edward was competent, no one could deny that. And over time, the scandal was replaced by other scandals, other stories. The market has a short memory when there's money involved. Within 2 years, Edward had rebuilt much of his business empire. But something had changed. He had changed. He began to delegate more, to trust his team, to not need to control every detail of every operation. He discovered, to his surprise, that the company ran better this way, that people work better when they trust and are trusted. It was a revelation that should have been obvious, but for Edward, accustomed to decades of total control, it was revolutionary. He also made personal changes. He sold the Upper East Side mansion. He couldn't be there anymore. Every room brought painful memories. He bought a smaller, more modern apartment in Soho. He donated most of the old furniture to charity. He was building a new life, even without knowing exactly what that life would be. Gus became a regular presence in his life again. They had dinner together at least once a month. Sometimes they talked about business, but often they just chatted about trivial things: football, politics, Edward's nieces, Gus's daughters, who were growing up. They were simple conversations, but they meant everything to Edward. It was real human connection, with no agenda, no hidden interests. About Helen, Edward knew almost nothing. Marcus would occasionally mention that she was well, that she had adapted to life in Dublin, that she seemed happy, but it was second-hand, vague information. Edward never asked directly. He felt he no longer had that right. He had lost the privilege of knowing about her life when he destroyed the marriage they shared. But he thought about her, especially at night when he was alone in the apartment and the silence became too loud. He thought about what could have been different, the choices he could have made, the words he could have said. It was a useless exercise, he knew. He couldn't change the past, but it was impossible not to wonder. Once, during a therapy session, Dr. Roberts asked, "Do you still love her?" Edward was silent for a long time. Finally, he answered, "I love the idea of her. I love who she was and who I could have been by her side. But the real Helen, the woman she has become away from me, I don't know her anymore. And I have no right to know her. I lost that right." It was an honest answer, perhaps the most honest Edward had ever given in his life. And in that honesty, there was an acceptance that some things are lost forever, that not everything can be fixed, that sometimes the only thing you can do is learn from your mistakes and try to be better from then on. New York City continued its frantic routine, the city that never sleeps, that never waits for anyone. Edward learned to exist in it in a different way, no longer as a conqueror, but as just another inhabitant trying to find his place. It was humbling in a way he had never been, and in that forced humility there was a strange kind of peace. It wasn't happiness, maybe it never would be, but it was acceptance, and for someone who had spent his life fighting against everything and everyone, acceptance was already considerable progress. Edward Travers, the millionaire who had lost everything that truly mattered, was learning to live with the consequences of his choices. And in that painful learning, he was finally beginning to become human. Chapter 6. 5 years had passed since that Friday that changed everything. 5 years that felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye, depending on when Edward allowed himself to remember. New York City continued its chaotic dance, indifferent to the personal transformations of its inhabitants. The seasons succeeded one another. New buildings rose where old houses once stood, and life followed its relentless course. Edward was different. Not just older, with a few more grey hairs, but fundamentally transformed. The therapy with Dr. Roberts had continued for 3 intense years. It had been a process of deconstruction and reconstruction that left him exhausted, but somehow lighter. He had learned to identify his patterns, his insecurities disguised as strength. He had learned slowly to be more human. Professionally, he had achieved a balance he had never imagined possible. He was still successful, still managed his business empire, but now with more detachment. He delegated decisions. He trusted his team. He spent entire weekends without thinking about work. It was a revolutionary concept for someone who, for decades, had defined his worth by what he produced and accumulated. He had also made significant changes in how he used his money. He had created a foundation dedicated to supporting women in abusive relationships. It wasn't a way to atone for his mistakes with Helen. He knew that was impossible. But it was a way to transform his pain into something useful. The foundation offered psychological, legal, and financial support. It had already helped hundreds of women in recent years. And when Edward visited the space, he saw in the eyes of those women a distorted reflection of what Helen must have felt. It was a constant and necessary reminder. Gus remained close. His brother had become not just family, but a genuine friend. They had dinner regularly, and Gus wasn't afraid to confront Edward when necessary. "You're becoming a better person, brother," he had said recently. "But don't forget that being better doesn't erase who you were. It's just a new layer." Edward knew it was true, The past didn't disappear. It just became part of a larger story. About Helen, Edward knew only what occasionally reached him through mutual acquaintances, that she was well, that she had settled in Dublin, that she worked for an NGO focused on educating immigrants, that she seemed happy, or at least at peace. Edward never tried to make contact. He respected the distance she had placed between them. It was the least he could do. But sometimes, in the lonely nights of his Soho apartment, Edward found himself thinking about what he would say to her if they had the chance to talk again. Would he apologize? Try to explain? Simply thank her for the years they shared? They were mental exercises that led nowhere, but they were inevitable. Some wounds scar over, but the scars remain sensitive. It was on a Saturday afternoon in September, as spring began to warm New York again, that Edward decided to visit a contemporary art gallery in Chelsea. It wasn't something he did often. Art had always been, for him, just an investment. Paintings were assets, not expressions of the soul. But in recent years he had tried to expand his horizons, to learn to appreciate beauty for what it was, not for what it was worth. The gallery was small, intimate. White walls, careful lighting, the smell of fresh coffee coming from the small attached cafe. There was an exhibition on display titled Reconstructions. According to the catalogue, it featured works by artists who had undergone profound personal transformations and translated those experiences through their creations. Edward walked slowly among the installations, trying to understand the underlying messages. It was as he turned into the last room of the gallery that he saw it. In the center of the space, illuminated by a soft light from the ceiling, was an installation that made him stop abruptly. It was a carved wooden box, open, displayed as if it were an altar. Inside, carefully reassembled torn letters, a wedding ring broken in half but joined by a thin thread of gold that symbolized both rupture and possible connection, and photographs showing the blurred faces of a couple that could have been anyone, but whom Edward recognized instantly. Next to the installation, protected by glass, was a phrase engraved in elegant letters. Love is not measured by pain. It is proven by trust. Edward felt his legs weaken. He approached slowly, as if in a trance. He looked at the plaque identifying the work. Title: Invisible Scars. Artist: Helen M. Travers. Year: 2030. His heart pounded. Helen. She was here. Her work, her emotions translated into art. It was her exposing herself, but also freeing herself. Next to the main installation there was a framed letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, even after all these years. Edward moved closer and read, his hands trembling slightly. This installation is not about revenge or resentment. It is about understanding and liberation. For years I carried wounds I didn't know how to heal. Wounds caused by misunderstood love, by broken trust, by unmet expectations. This work represents my healing journey. The torn letters are memories that needed to be acknowledged before they could be released. The broken ring is a symbol that some endings are necessary, and the gold thread that joins it is the recognition that despite everything, there was real love, distorted, imperfect, but real. This work is my final goodbye to the past and my embrace of the future. Edward read and reread the words. There was so much serenity in that letter, so much peace. Helen had clearly walked a path of healing that he was still treading. He felt a confusing mix of emotions, pride that she had found her voice, sadness for the pain he had caused, relief that she had moved on, and a sharp pang of loss that had never truly disappeared. "Do you know the artist?" A female voice interrupted his thoughts. Edward turned and saw a woman in her 40s, her hair in a ponytail, dressed casually but elegantly. She wore a badge identifying her as a gallery employee. "Yes," Edward replied, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "I did, a long time ago." The woman smiled kindly. "This is one of the most impactful works in the exhibition. Helen came specially from Dublin for the opening, but she's already gone back. She left this installation as part of a traveling collection about overcoming and personal reconstruction." Edward nodded, unable to speak. The employee sensed his emotion and discreetly moved away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Edward stood there for over an hour, just looking, processing. That installation was the closure Helen needed. It was her way of saying she had moved on, but also of acknowledging that what they had lived was real. Not just pain, but also love. An imperfect, mismanaged love, suffocated by insecurities, but love nonetheless. When he finally decided to leave, he stopped at the gallery's reception desk. He asked if it was possible to buy the piece. The receptionist checked and informed him that this particular piece was not for sale. It was part of a larger project that would tour different cities, but she offered the exhibition catalogue, which included detailed photos and explanatory texts. Edward bought it. It was the closest he would get to having a piece of that closure. In the days that followed, Edward found himself constantly thinking about the installation. He couldn't get the serenity of those words out of his head. The gold thread that joins it is the recognition that, despite everything there, was real love. Helen had achieved something he was still struggling to reach. She had transformed pain into art, trauma into beauty, an ending into a new beginning. During his next session with Dr. Roberts, yes, he still had therapy occasionally, Edward told him about the visit to the gallery. The therapist listened attentively. "And how did you feel seeing that?" he asked. Edward thought carefully before answering. "I felt proud of her, for finding a way to process and release everything, and I felt sad for myself, for still being stuck in some ways." Dr. Roberts nodded. "But do you realize that you are also in the process of healing, that the fact you can feel pride for her without jealousy or resentment is already immense progress?" Edward had never thought of it that way, but it was true. 5 years ago, his reaction would have been completely different. He would have felt anger, perhaps, or the need to control the narrative. Now he only felt a melancholic sadness and respect for her journey. It was growth, slow, painful, but real. A few weeks after the gallery visit, Edward did something he had been considering for months. He wrote a letter to Helen. He had no address to send it directly, so he asked Marcus to forward it through the appropriate legal channels, respecting her decision if she chose not to have contact. The letter was not long. It didn't try to justify, explain, or ask for forgiveness dramatically. It was simple and honest. "Helen," the letter began, "I saw your installation at the gallery and was deeply touched, not just by the work itself, but by what it represents. Your ability to transform pain into beauty, to find peace in chaos. I want you to know that I have spent the last few years trying to become a better person. Not to get you back, I know that ship has sailed long ago, but to honor the time we shared, by being someone worthy of the good memories I still carry. I hope you are immensely happy, wherever you are, with whoever you are with. You deserve all the peace you have earned. Your work is an inspiration, and your strength was always greater than I was able to see. With respect and gratitude for the time we had, Edward." He sent the letter with no expectation of a reply. It was more for him than for her, a way to externalize thoughts he had carried for years, a way to close another cycle. Marcus confirmed a few weeks later that the letter had been delivered. Whether Helen would respond or not was her choice, and Edward would respect any decision. The reply came 3 months later. Edward was in his office when his secretary handed him an envelope, postmarked from Dublin. His heart sped up when he saw the handwriting on the envelope. It was hers. He asked for privacy, closed his office door and sat down to open. Helen's letter was short but kind. "Thank you for your words." It began. "I'm glad to know you are pursuing personal growth. That process is never easy, but it is always valuable. About us, I've learned that some stories end, not because someone is a villain, but because imperfect people met at the wrong times in their lives. You weren't evil, Edward. You were wounded. And wounded people often hurt others, even without meaning to. I had my own flaws too. I could have been more assertive, clearer about my needs. I kept silences that should have been conversations." The letter continued. "I hold no grudge, I sincerely don't. What we went through taught me about a strength I didn't know I had. It taught me about my limits and the importance of valuing myself. In a twisted sense, Our separation was my liberation. I have built a life here that brings me peace. I work with refugee children teaching English. It's simple but meaningful. I have friends. I have purpose. I have peace. I hope you find yours as well. Not all endings are happy, but some are necessary. And ours was. Take care, Edward. With sincere affection. From someone who was once part of your life, Helen. Edward read the letter several times. There was genuine forgiveness in those words. Not the kind of forgiveness that forgets or minimizes, but the kind that recognizes humanity in failure. Helen had found her peace. And finally, reading those words, Edward felt something begin to dissolve within him. The guilt he carried, the regret that haunted him, didn't disappear, but they lost some of their weight. He carefully placed the letter in a special drawer of his desk. Next to it he put the exhibition catalogue with the photo of the Invisible Scars installation. They were his reminders, not of what he lost but of what he learned, of the price of not honoring what we have while we have it, of the importance of trusting, communicating, being vulnerable. The following months brought more changes. Edward began to open himself up to the possibility of new relationships, not rushed, not urgent, but the idea that maybe, one day, he could share his transformed life with someone no longer seemed impossible. He went on a few dates. Some were pleasant, others disastrous, but he was trying, he was present. He was, for the first time in decades, genuinely trying to connect. He also intensified his work at the foundation. He personally participated in support sessions, always behind the scenes, never promoting himself. But he was there, listening to stories that echoed parts of his own, offering resources but also presence, learning that helping others was, in a way, continuing his own healing. A year after the exchange of letters with Helen, Edward was in his apartment on a Sunday afternoon when he received a notification. It was an email with a link. The message was simple. Thought you might like to know, Saz, the Reconstructions exhibition is being documented. This is the mini-documentary about my piece, Helen. Edward clicked the link with slightly trembling hands. It was a 15-minute video. It showed Helen explaining her installation, talking about the creative process, about what led her to create that work. She looked different, her hair a little shorter, a few grey strands she didn't hide, soft wrinkles around her eyes when she smiled. But the most striking thing was her expression. There was a lightness he didn't remember seeing before, a serenity that came from within. In the video, Helen spoke about overcoming, without mentioning names or specific details. She talked about a relationship that ended painfully, but taught her about her own strength, about how art was her therapy, her way of processing and releasing, and she ended by saying something that echoed in Edward's mind. Not all loves last forever, but all loves, including those that end, teach us something about ourselves. The point isn't to avoid pain, but to learn from it. Edward watched the video 3 times in a row. Then he wrote a simple reply. Thank you for sharing. You are radiant. Your journey is inspiring. He didn't know if Helen read it. There was no response, but it wasn't needed. That gesture of sharing her work, her healing, was a message in itself. It was a final nod, a recognition that they had both traveled difficult but necessary paths. A few more years passed. Edward turned 65. He was semi-retired, spending more time at the foundation than on business. Gus teased him, saying he had become sentimental in his old age. And maybe it was true, but it was an earned sentimentality, not an imposed one. It was the ability to feel that he had repressed for decades. There was a peace in his life now. Not the peace of someone who has everything figured out, but the peace of someone who has accepted his imperfections. He still had bad days. He still caught himself falling into old patterns occasionally, but he recognized them more quickly, corrected them when possible. It was constant work, but valuable. About Helen, indirect news occasionally arrived, that she had published a book about her experience working with refugees, that her art was gaining international recognition, that she was happy. Edward was genuinely pleased with each update. No jealousy, no paralyzing regret, just a distant affection for someone who had been an important part of his story. On a particularly clear autumn afternoon, Edward was in his apartment when he looked out the window and saw the leaves falling from the trees on the street. He remembered something Dr. Roberts had said years ago. Leaves have to fall for new ones to grow. It's not death, it's a cycle. He finally understood. His marriage to Helen had to end. Not because it was fate, not because it was inevitable, but because they both needed that symbolic death to be reborn. Edward was no longer the man who had set up that cruel test 5 years ago. That man had died slowly, in therapy sessions, in moments of solitary reflection, in painful confrontations with his own shadows. The Edward that existed now was a renewed version. Still imperfect, still scarred, but conscious, present, human. And Helen, on the other side of the Atlantic, had also transformed. She had not just survived, but flourished. She had found her voice, her purpose, her peace. Their relationship hadn't worked out, but they had both grown in ways they might not have grown together. It was a strange but real consolation. That night, Edward took a piece of paper and wrote something he would never send. A final letter not to Helen, but to himself. In it, he listed everything he had learned, about trust, about vulnerability, about the importance of communication, about how love is not control but freedom, about how true strength is not never breaking, but being able to put yourself back together after being broken. He ended the letter with a sentence he planned to carry for the rest of his life. Love is not measured by pain. It is proven by trust. They were the words from Helen's installation, words that were now part of his own life's code, a constant reminder of what he lost, but also of what he gained, the wisdom that only comes through processed and transformed pain. Edward folded the letter carefully and stored it with the others, his personal archive of transformation. He looked out the window one more time, at the city that continued its endless dance. New York waited for no one. But now Edward no longer needed to fight against that current. He could simply flow, aware that every moment was an opportunity to be better than he was the moment before. And somewhere in Dublin, Helen also looked out the window of her small apartment near the River Liffey. The river's waves reflected the evening light. She smiled to herself, thinking about how life had strange ways of taking us exactly where we need to be. The past was past, the future was uncertain, but the present, this exact moment, was hers. And that was enough.